Mexico was not the only Latin American nation Polk took an interest in. He was successful in negotiating a treaty with New Granada, giving the United States the right-of-way through the Isthmus of Panama. This treaty allowed Americans to sail to Panama and then cross a short stretch of jungle to board another ship to sail to California, effectively cutting the travel time from New York to San Francisco in half. He also intended to purchase the island of Cuba from the Spanish government for $100 million before the Spanish changed their mind and decided that the resource-rich colony wasn't for sale. Polk was a strong believer in the idea of Jacksonian democracy, an idea that the power of the people should control all aspects of government, and that the president elected by the people should power over unelected judges. Jackson had fought several duels over politics, and once said that his biggest regret of his political career was not having Henry Clay and his own vice president, John Calhoun, executed. Polk was much more courteous towards political rivals, but shared the same dedication to the Jacksonian ideals. They had been the party that had so strongly fought for suffrage for all white men, regardless of party. Polk and the Jacksonian Democrats believed strongly in the principle majority rule, and so they believed strongly that the majority of white male citizens had the power to do what they wanted with the country, including oppress those who weren't allowed a voice in this government. Slavery was an important issue of the day that would lead, just 11 years after Polk left office, to the bloodiest war ever on American soil. Polk's Democratic Party was predominantly pro-slavery, while their opponents, the Whigs, were not united on the issue. Some sought to stop the spread of slavery, while others preferred to ignore the issue altogether. A third-party abolitionist candidate, Bernie, had won 2% of the popular vote in the 1844 election. Abolitionists considered the Mexican-American War an attempt by President Polk to spread the institution of slavery and punish the nation of Mexico, which had abolished slavery in 1821, and was offering sanctuary for escaped slaves. Polk was elected into office, whose powers had been expanded greatly by his own friend and mentor, Andrew Jackson. Jackson had been more of an elected emperor than an imperial president. The press had nicknamed him King Andrew. When the Supreme Court ruled that he had no authority to move the Cherokee from their land, he simply ignored their decision and did it anyway. Still, he regained the highest popularity of any president in his century. As Speaker of the House, Polk had supported each expanse of the power of the presidency. He would prove justified in his label as a Jacksonian Democrat. Still, they were against presidential interference on economic matters. Jackson had set a record for presidential vetoes at 12 in his two-term administration. John Tyler, Polk's immediate predecessor and an anti-Jacksonian Whig, had used 10 vetoes in just under 4 years. Despite using fewer vetoes than any other president of his era, Polk lived up to his old nickname, Young Hickory, by being a strong executive willing to strong-arm Congress when necessary. Many who met Polk described him as being cold, sickly, and foreboding. Even his supporters would agree that he was far from the most charismatic American president. Still, he kept a great deal of power, and he maintained a fairly high approval rating outside of Washington and the Whig-dominated Northeast. Sarah Polk was perhaps the greatest reason for this popularity that stayed put throughout the presidency. Sarah was praised by newspapers as a perfect example of a first lady. She was white, upper class, well-mannered, educated, religious, charming, and gracious. She retained popularity even with Whigs because of the couple's policy of never speaking ill of political opponents. The only criticism for Sarah Polk came in her decision to ban dancing from the executive mansion and her attempt to ban visitors on Sunday. This came as a result of her very strict religious upbringing. Even when ill, she seldom missed a church service. She also assisted her husband by providing what could be argued as the first presidential briefings. Sarah read several newspapers every morning and marked the most important passages to share with her husband. One traditional-style scandal rocked the Polk administration. Polk believed in what would eventually be called the spoils system, again in the mold of his mentor, Andrew Jackson. Political allies of the president were appointed to positions occupied by Whigs, who were fired. a move very reminiscent of Jackson's own actions 16 years earlier. These actions were generally acceptable to the general public. However, the public did not look kindly on the $35,000 of taxpayer funds, more than $1 million in today's currency, that was siphoned into a Democratic newspaper, the Washington Globe, who'd been one of Polk's greatest supporters during the 1844 election cycle. President Polk, in a move that might make Richard Nixon proud, made sure to maintain deniability, and the scandal was never traced directly back to him, only to members of his cabinet. As one of the most expansionist administrations in American history, Polk's presidency saw 3 states enter the Union. The Republic of Texas was formally admitted to the Union as the state of Texas on December 29, 1845, after 8 years of attempting to negotiate its annexation. This is a move that would lead to war with Mexico less than a year later. 364 days after Texas's admittance, Polk signed a bill admitting the state of Iowa. Some considered such action hasty, as the Iowa Territory had only existed independently for less than a decade. Wisconsin, a territory of the United States for the entirety of the nation's existence, became the 30th state in 1848. Polk's presidency also saw the establishment of several institutions very familiar to Americans today. Polk's Secretary of the Navy, George Bancroft, established a Navy school on the grounds of a former Army post in Annapolis, Maryland. The institution is now known as the United States Naval Academy. The first official U.S. postage stamps were created in 1847, depicting the likenesses of George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Construction also began on the Washington Memorial, while Polk occupied the Executive Mansion, a project that would eventually be called the Washington Monument, and that would not be completed until 1884. The Smithsonian Institute was founded on August 6, 1846, as a museum for the American public. Polk established the Department of the Interior in the final days of his presidency. The national debt at the beginning of the 1844 fiscal year, the year of Polk's election, was $23.46 billion. Polk cut the debt to just under $16 billion by July 1st of 1845. In a year, the debt continued to shrink to just $15.5 billion. The latter half of 1846 and the beginning of 1847, however, saw a dramatic climb in the national debt. By the election of 1848, it was over $47 billion. At the end of the fiscal year, on July 1st, 1849, just a few months after Polk left office, another fiscal year ended, and the debt stood at over $63 billion, while a 268.7 increase in the national debt occurred just over one term of the presidency. Of course, that's something that typically happens when you cut revenue while fighting a war. This is certainly a comparison Governor Romney would certainly not want to make.